The summer of 1943 brought a heat so oppressive to the Italian peninsula that soldiers on both sides wondered if the sun itself had joined the war, and somewhere along the dusty roads leading north from Sicily, a young black woman rode in a convoy of Red Cross vehicles, her eyes scanning the devastated landscape for signs of the wounded and the dying, and her name was Dorothy Thompson, and she was one of the first African-American women to serve with the American Red Cross in an active combat zone. And what she did not know as that convoy rumbled forward was that within weeks she would become a prisoner of the German Reich, and her survival would depend on reserves of courage she did not yet know she possessed. She had grown up in Baltimore in a neighborhood where dreams were often crushed by the weight of segregation and poverty, but her mother had taught her that healing hands could open doors that prejudice tried to keep closed, and so Dorothy had studied nursing with a fierce determination that surprised everyone who underestimated her. And when the war came, she had volunteered immediately, knowing that wounded soldiers needed care, regardless of the color of their skin, and the Red Cross had hesitated at first, uncertain whether America was ready for black women serving so close to the front lines. But Dorothy had persisted, and her persistence had brought her here to this ancient land, now torn apart by modern war. The Italian campaign was brutal in ways that the newsreels back home never showed, and the Allied forces had landed in Sicily in July of 1943 and then pushed north onto the mainland in September, and every mile of advancement came at a terrible cost in blood and lives, and the Germans fought with desperate skill, defending every hilltop, every river crossing, every ancient village, and the wounded poured into field hospitals faster than the medical staff could treat them. And Dorothy worked alongside doctors and nurses, treating shattered bodies and trying to maintain some small measure of humanity in the midst of industrial slaughter. But what happened next changed everything, because in early October, the convoy she was traveling with took a wrong turn on roads that had been hastily marked and poorly mapped, and they found themselves not heading toward the Allied lines, but directly into a German ambush, and the first shots came without warning, shattering the windshield of the lead vehicle and sending glass flying like deadly snowflakes, and Dorothy threw herself to the floor of her ambulance as bullets punched through the canvas sides, and the screams of the wounded mixed with the roar of German machine guns. And in that moment, time seemed to slow, and she could see every detail with terrible clarity. The battle lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours, and when the shooting stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise, and German soldiers approached the wrecked vehicles. Their weapons raised their faces hard with the exhaustion of men who had been fighting for years, and Dorothy rose slowly, her hands visible, her Red Cross armband prominent against her dark skin, and the Germans stopped and stared because they had never seen anything quite like her, and their confusion gave her a moment to assess the situation, and she counted 7 American dead and 12 wounded, and she knew that what happened next would determine whether any of them survived. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because the German officer in command was a man named Hauptmann Werner Kruger, and he was a veteran of campaigns in Poland and France and Russia, and he had seen horrors that had stripped away much of his humanity. But something in the way this black woman stood among the carnage, her chin raised, her eyes defiant, stood a memory of the doctor who had treated his mother when he was a child, and that doctor had also been dark-skinned, a visitor from Africa to the German university town where Werner had grown up. And in that strange connection across years and continents, a decision was made that would save lives. The prisoners were marched north, along roads that wound through countryside that would have been beautiful under other circumstances, and olive groves stretched across rolling hills and ancient stone farmhouses dotted the landscape, and the September sun beat down with merciless intensity, and Dorothy walked with the wounded, helping those who could barely stand, refusing to leave anyone behind. And the German guards watched her with a mixture of curiosity and grudging respect, because they had never seen a woman work so hard for men who were technically her enemies. And she treated German wounded too, when she was allowed pulling shrapnel from flesh and bandaging wounds with supplies she had managed to salvage from the ambush. And then something no one expected happened, because as they approached a small village called San Pietro, a formation of American thunderbolts appeared over the horizon, their engines screaming as they dove toward the column, and Dorothy threw herself over a wounded soldier as the world exploded around her, and she felt the heat of explosions and the sting of flying debris, and when the planes finally departed, she lifted her head to find that the German guards had scattered, and for one brief moment she and the surviving prisoners were alone, and the road north lay open before them. The decision was impossible, because they could try to escape heading south toward the Allied lines, but most of the wounded could not walk, and leaving them behind was unthinkable, and Dorothy looked at the faces of the young American soldiers, some barely 18 years old, and she knew that she could not abandon them. And so when the German guards returned, she was still there, still tending wounds, still refusing to let anyone die alone. And Hauptmann Kruger looked at her with something that might have been admiration, and he ordered his men to find a cart for the wounded, and the march continued. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because the village where they finally stopped had been a partisan stronghold before the Germans arrived, and hidden in the cellars and caves around the town were Italian resistance fighters, who watched the German column with calculating eyes. And they saw the black woman in the Red Cross uniform, and they began to plan, because anyone who could move freely among the Germans was valuable. And that night a young Italian girl no more than 14 slipped into the building where Dorothy was being held, and pressed a note into her hand, and disappeared into the shadows before anyone could see. The note was written in broken English, and it asked for information about German troop movements and supply routes and weapons, and Dorothy knew that if she was caught helping the partisans, she would be executed without trial, and she also knew that the information could save Allied lives and shorten the war and bring an end to the killing. And so she began to watch and listen and remember, and every night she would slip the information to contacts, who appeared and disappeared like ghosts, and she became a spy in the heart of the German war machine, operating under the protection of her Red Cross armband and her apparent helplessness. The weeks turned into months, and Dorothy was moved from camp to camp, always tending the wounded, always gathering information, always walking the razor-thin line between life and death. And she learned to read German troop movements, from the anxiety of officers and the complaints of enlisted men, and she learned which supply lines were vulnerable and which positions were weakly held, and all of this she passed along through the network of partisans who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, and she never knew if her information was reaching the Allies, but she kept gathering it, because that was all she could do. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because in late November she overheard a conversation between two German officers discussing a planned counteroffensive designed to push the Allies back into the sea at Anzio. And the operation was scheduled for February, and it involved divisions that were being secretly transferred from the Russian front. Now, Dorothy knew that this information was worth more than her own life, and she memorized every detail, the unit numbers, the timing, the objectives, and she began to plan her escape. The winter of 1943 into 44 was the coldest Italy had seen in decades, and snow covered the mountain passages, and ice formed on the rivers, and the war ground to a bloody stalemate as both sides dug in and waited for spring. And Dorothy continued her work treating pneumonia and frostbite in the endless stream of wounds that modern warfare produced, and she built trust with her German captors, appearing cooperative and harmless, while she waited for the right moment to run. And that moment came on a night in January, when the partisan network finally sent word that they were ready. The escape route led through mountain passes that were barely passable in summer and suicidal in winter, but there was no other way, and Dorothy left the camp at midnight, crawling through a gap in the fence that a sympathetic guard had conveniently failed to repair, and she carried nothing but the clothes on her back and the intelligence in her head, and she met her partisan contacts at a ruined church 3 miles from the camp, and together they began the climb into the mountains. The journey took 5 days and nights through snow that reached her waist and temperatures that froze her breath into ice crystals on her face, and Dorothy had never known such cold, had never imagined that the human body could endure such punishment, and yet she kept moving because the alternative was death, and because the information she carried was too important to die with her, and the partisans who guided her were young and old men and women who had lost everything to the German occupation and had nothing left but their determination to fight. And she drew strength from their courage as they drew strength from hers. They crossed the Allied lines on the morning of January 27, 1944, near the town of Cassino, where one of the bloodiest battles of the Italian campaign was about to begin, and Dorothy walked out of the mountains a ghost of the woman she had been, her fingers blackened by frostbite, her body racked by fever and exposure, and she collapsed into the arms of American soldiers who could not believe what they were seeing, and her first words were not about herself, but about the intelligence she carried, and the counteroffensive that was coming. The information she provided was rushed up the chain of command, and it reached General Mark Clark himself, and adjustments were made to the defensive positions at Anzio. And when the German attack came on February 16th, it was met by prepared defenders who knew exactly where the blow would fall, and thousands of American soldiers survived that battle because of the intelligence Dorothy had carried through the mountains, and she never knew the full extent of what she had accomplished, because that information was classified for decades, but she knew that she had done her duty. The hospital where she recovered was in Naples, a city that bore the scars of occupation and liberation in equal measure, and bombed buildings stood beside ancient churches, and the streets were filled with refugees and soldiers in the chaos of a world at war. And Dorothy lay in her bed, her hands bandaged to save what remained of her frostbitten fingers, and she thought about the young men she had left behind in German captivity, and she wondered if any of them had survived, and she prayed for them as she had prayed during all those months of imprisonment. Spring came to Italy with its promise of renewal, but the war continued with undiminished fury, and the battle for Monte Cassino raged 4 months, destroying the ancient monastery that had stood for 14 centuries. And Dorothy watched from her hospital bed as the news came in of advances and retreats, of victories and defeats, of the endless toll of dead and wounded, and she wanted nothing more than to return to work, to use her healing hands again, but the doctors told her she needed more time, and rest was its own kind of torture. By summer she was well enough to return to duty, though she would never fully recover from the ordeal, and her damaged hands made delicate work difficult, and the cold would forever bring back memories of that terrible journey through the mountains. But she refused to go home and insisted on remaining in Italy and continuing her work, and the Red Cross assigned her to a hospital in Rome, which had been liberated in June, and she spent the final year of the war tending to the wounded and helping to put back together the pieces of a shattered world. The soldiers she treated rarely knew her story because she did not speak of it, and the officers who knew kept the information classified, and she was just another Red Cross worker to most of the men who passed through her care. But those who looked closely could see something in her eyes that spoke of experiences beyond ordinary comprehension, and some of them asked, and she would smile and change the subject and continue her work, because that was what she had always done, and that was what she would continue to do. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, and Dorothy stood in the streets of Rome as the crowd celebrated, and she thought of all the people who had not lived to see this day, and she wept for them and for herself and for the world that had allowed such horror to happen, and she wondered what kind of peace would follow such a war, and whether humanity had learned anything at all from the millions of graves that now dotted the landscape of Europe, and she had no answers, only questions that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She returned to Baltimore in the autumn of 1945, to a nation that was not ready to honor black heroes and the segregation that had marked her childhood still held sway, and the sacrifices she had made were deemed less valuable because of the color of her skin, and the medals she should have received were never awarded, and the recognition she deserved was never given. And she went back to nursing in a colored hospital, treating patients who would never know that the woman changing their bandages had once walked through hell and emerged carrying secrets that had saved thousands of lives. The decades passed, and Dorothy married and raised children and grew old in a country that was slowly, painfully beginning to change, and she watched as the civil rights movement challenged the walls of segregation that had defined her youth, and she marched when she could and supported those who fought for justice. And she never forgot the young Italian girl who had pressed that first note into her hand, or the partisans who had guided her through the mountains, or the German officer who had chosen mercy when he could have chosen death. History has a way of finding its heroes, even when they try to hide. And in the 1990s, researchers began to uncover the stories of African Americans who had served in World War II, and someone found a reference to a black Red Cross worker who had escaped from German captivity with intelligence about the Anzio camp. And the search began for Dorothy Thompson, and when they found her, she was 92 years old, living quietly in a nursing home in Baltimore, her memories fading but still sharp enough to confirm the incredible story that the documents suggested. She received her medals, finally, in a small ceremony at the nursing home in 1998. More than 50 years after the events, they commemorated, and generals and politicians came to pay tribute, and cameras recorded the moment for posterity. And Dorothy sat in her wheelchair, wearing the Bronze Star and the Prisoner of War Medal and the Presidential Unicitation. And she smiled for the cameras, but those who knew her could see that her thoughts were elsewhere, far away in the mountains of Italy, where a young woman had once walked through the snow, carrying hope in her frozen hands. She passed away in 2003 at the age of 97, and the obituary in the Baltimore Sun told her story for the first time, and people who had known her all their lives learned that the quiet old lady who had lived down the street was a hero of the Second World War, and letters poured in from families of soldiers who believed their fathers or grandfathers might have been among those she saved, and the nation finally paused to honor a woman it had overlooked for so long. And so we remember Dorothy Thompson now standing on that dusty Italian road, her Red Cross armband bright against her dark skin, her eyes meeting the eyes of her captors without fear. And we remember her walking through the prison camps, healing wounds and gathering secrets. And we remember her climbing through the frozen mountains, refusing to surrender to the cold and the despair. And we remember her collapsing into the arms of American soldiers, her mission complete, her intelligence delivered. And we remember her returning to a nation that did not yet know how to value her sacrifice. And we remember her living quietly for decades, asking for nothing, carrying her memories in silence. And we remember that finally at the end of her long life, her country found the words to say thank you. And we remember that her story is our story, a story of courage and resilience and the unbreakable human spirit. And as long as we tell it, she will never truly be gone, and her light will continue to shine through the darkness of history, illuminating the path for all those who come after.